We just spent quite a bit of time talking about Native American spirituality and particularly the importance of balance. Now we're going to talk about some broader cultural concepts which would lead to misunderstandings between Native people and the Euro Americans whom they would encounter. And much of this held true across the continent, like a lot of the stuff we've been talking about. First thing I want to discuss is represented with this image, which is not from the Great Plains, 21 by a Catawba Indian. The Catawbas lived in the Carolinas, and it was actually the governor of South Carolina who asked this Catawba man to make him a map of the interior of the American Southeast, where the English were pushing, away from the coast and into the interior. And this is what was brought back to the governor. This is a map. Looking at it, you might not think it looks like a map. It sort of looks like, if anything, a map of a molecule or a system of molecules. But this demonstrates the Catawba individual, and in fact, indigenous people thought about space and place. So in this map, which is drawn on a deer skin that's stretched out, and the way that these maps would be used on a deer skin, which is pretty big, is it would be stretched out on the ground, and Native people would stand all around it to look at it. So there's really no top or bottom or up or down, because you could kind of move around the edges of it. And this actual map is still in existence. You can see it in Washington, D.C. at the Museum of the American Indian. So on this map of the American Southeast, each one of these circles represents a different tribe. And the way they're laid out and the lines that connect them essentially showed which tribes were allied with whom, and therefore which ones were enemies of whom. And to the Catawba guy, that's what you needed to know. He did not make a map in the sense that probably the governor was expecting. Their graphic representations. Certainly there are no boundaries, because there was no concept of a hard and specific boundary as an imaginary line on a map that people would conform to. Now, there is some indication of a relativity. If you look to the lower right over here, you see a diamond shape, which is actually, if you're standing on that side, a square, and that is marked Virginia. So that represents the colony of Virginia. And then over on the far left, kind of like a maze, a bunch of right angles and lines and squares, that represents Charleston, South Carolina. Now, this is not how they'd be laid out on a Western map with the cardinal directions indicated and so forth. But what it does, for one thing, is it differentiates between indigenous people and European people. The indigenous people are all represented by circles, the Europeans by squares and right angles. Now, earlier I mentioned Black Elk Speaks, which is a book that, if you haven't read, you should. Black Elk was an Oglala Lakota Sioux who was a medicine man who was interviewed 1920s, 1930s, and essentially a whole book was written, which was his record of his life, his beliefs, his people's beliefs, and his visions. And in that, Black Elk said, and this is talking about his own people, the Lakota, he said that in nature, there are no squares. In nature, there are no right angles. That's why nature is represented by circles. And if there's something that is square, that indicates that humans have been working at it. And because his people, the Lakota Sioux, are close to Wakantanka and close to nature and close to the earth, they're very are round, whereas, white people's houses are square, showing their disconnection from nature. Now, if you look in the lower left-hand corner, what looks like maybe an umbrella, looks like maybe Mary Poppins, but actually we're looking at it upside down. If you were looking at it from the other way and you flip that over, you would see it is actually representing a ship with sails. So that represents the harbor, the Charleston Harbor. But there are these other things there. For example, over on the right, you see a woman. That represents the harbor, the Charleston Harbor. But there are these other things there. For example, over on the right, you see a woman in a dress. What does that mean? Well, that represents this Catawba's man's home village, and looking at his home village as his mother. So that's his home village. Then you look over to the left, and again, you have to sort of look at it as if you were standing over on the left. You can see this figure that looks like a little stick figure man throwing spears or maybe shooting. That represents the Catawba man, his people's hunting grounds, which is usually not right where they live. So it's a ways off. So what all this means is that the way he looked at the physical world and representing it did include, and you've got the square buildings and so forth. But he's not looking at boundaries because they don't exist. He's not looking at the natural landscape, probably because he figures you should know that. His view of what a map is it shows groups of people and how they're related. It shows groups of people and how they're related to each other. All right? So that's one thing. And there are maps like this. There are examples of maps like this from other tribes and other parts of the country. This is a door flap off of a teepee, I think from a Crow man, and it has this spiral there. Now I say spiral calendar. This isn't meant to be a calendar. This is this particular thing is the story of this man's life. This flap came from the story of his life, and each image is a year in his life, and so he draws something significant about that year, like a good hunt or a bad winter or whatever. But the point is, it's not a straight line. It's a spiral. And in fact, all throughout the Americas, you can see the image of a spiral representing time. That is very different from the European or Western. And it's weird to call European Western, isn't it? Because it's east of the North Americans. But very different from represented by a timeline that is a straight line. And on a timeline in the European tradition, you got this straight line, and to the left it stretches into the past, way, 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 it just keeps going to infinity. And to the right it stretches into the future, and that is the time in a linear fashion, sequentially. Well, the things on this this tent fob are sequential, but they're not necessarily linear. They're in a spiral. And okay, that's a different way of representing time. That is also a different way of thinking about spiral. And okay, that's a different way of representing time. That is also a different way of thinking about time. Now, which one of these is accurate? Neither one, because time is not a thing you can see or represent or measure, right? So it's just concepts. But the concept is different. With a spiral instead of a straight line, what that means is that the future and the past are never really that far away. They're close by. They're connected. So you could be standing in the middle of this spiral. Your future and your past, you could reach out and touch them. Now, you can't literally do the thing that can be physically represented as time, but it's a way of thinking in which, looking at that line, the distant future, is so far away, it doesn't really seem to matter. And if you're at whatever point on that line, if you were actually physically on that point, you wouldn't be thinking. But if you picture yourself on this spiral, the future is close by. The past is not far away. And so that ties in with that idea of balance and cause and effect that I talked about. An idea in with that idea of balance and cause and effect that I talked about. An idea of the present, the past, and the future all being tied much closer together. So that kind of leads to you thinking about the future. Pretty deep stuff, actually. But if you stop and think about what we just looked at, the map and the calendar, what that means is that indigenous people had a completely different concept of space and time than Europeans. And those are such basic fundamental things that how much else are they going to be on a different page about? All right, another thing that Native people were on a different page with was property. Now, Europeans claimed that Indians, uncivilized barbaric people in general, had no concept of property. And because they had no concept of property, it's okay to take their land away because they don't know they own it. So that means they're just part of it, not owners of it. But that's not how Native people looked at it or still look at it. The traditional Native way of looking at the land was, how could anyone own the dirt? How could anyone own the water? How could anyone own the air? You're on it, and you're using it. You have a right to use it. And maybe one band has a right to use a certain area, but no one owns it. Now, this doesn't mean they had no personal property at all, because, if you were, let's say, a Cheyenne man and you sat down and made some arrows and you worked all day making arrows, and you made a bow too, those are yours. And if you put them in your teepee, and then you leave and some other guy yours. And if you put them in your teepee, and then you leave and some other guy wanders in and just takes them, well, he took your stuff. So it's not like they don't have an idea of owning something, but they don't have an idea of owning the land, or the air, or the water, or owning living things. Often would happen in agricultural societies, and you have to realize that by far the great majority, I'm just pulling a number out of the air here, but 95% of Native communities were agricultural. Really, only on the plains did you see a large number of nomadic, lived in the archaic era, where they're always on the move, following game. For the most part, people lived in towns and villages, and they had farms. And what would usually happen is that in that village, there would be one big community. Corn was grown, and everybody would work in it. And then at the end of the season, that corn would be distributed to, like among the Cherokees. They had this thing, Cherokees and other southern tribes, called the green corn ceremony. But that corn would be distributed to each family according to how big the family was and what it was deemed they would probably need. And then part of it would be set aside just in case, and put in a storage building. And if you miscalculated, you ran out, your family, you could go and take some from that community group, a community building you needed. And nobody's going to take it all. You take what you need. And then what was left over, they would then burn as a sacrifice, which freaked out Europeans when they saw that because they thought it was wasteful. But the fact is, they're all working together in the big plot. They might have individual small gardens to grow other stuff, but everybody is participating and everybody is benefiting to the extent of their own family's needs. Nobody owns any of it. Potlatch, that's in the Pacific Northwest, not in the plains, but maybe you've heard of that ceremony. Party, essentially. And you have all your friends and neighbors over, and you give away all your stuff, which means that even your personal possessions, you don't get that attached to because it's temporary. Really, everybody has a stake in owning everything together. And that's something that, Europeans did not understand, later Americans, white Americans, did not understand. So these native groups, whether agricultural or whether subsisting primarily on hunting, like many of the Plains tribes did, were subsistence culture each day to subsist or survive. They didn't produce extra or acquire extra. That wasn't their goal, to acquire extra. Their goal was today's needs. Now, in those communities, and this is true on the plains and elsewhere, your prestige as a member of the village, your prestige did not come from how much stuff you had. It came from how much stuff you gave away. So you might want to get stuff by participating in raids against enemy tribes to take their stuff away, but not because you're going to take it home and you're going to keep it, so that you'll have more to give away, and that is going to raise you in the esteem of your fellow tribal members or villagers. The more you give away, the more you are looked at as someone who contributes to the overall good, overall welfare. The more you're going to be viewed as a good person to have around, maybe a trustworthy person, an admirable person. So Euro-American ways of doing things. And that brings me to this story that I want to make sure I didn't forget to tell. It's jumping way ahead in time to the late 1800s, but it concerns someone you've probably heard of, Tatanka Iyotaka, or Sitting Bull. Tatanka Iyotaka, or Sitting Bull, who was a spiritual leader of the Lakota Sioux. I think he was of the Hunkpapa tribe or band. One of the leaders of the in the Sioux War, which led in 1876 to General Custer, George Armstrong Custer, having a very, very bad and kind of short day. You're probably familiar with that. We'll be talking about him in great detail later on. That's what I'm talking about. Now, after the Battle of the Little Bighorn and the death of Custer, where the Indians won, things went badly for them. And so Sitting Bull and some of his people escaped to Canada and stayed there for a while. Then he eventually came back to the United States and got a job with Buffalo Bill. Buffalo Bill, who was formerly a scout and buffalo hunter, but had become a showman and operated Buffalo Bill's Traveling Wild West Circus, or Wild West Show, which is like a big circus under a big top, and it would tour the country, and even they crossed the ocean, went to Europe and toured Europe to show people what things were like in the West, but it wasn't really what it was like, right? It was all for show. But Sitting Bull got a job for a while performing in this Wild West show. And just like everyone else that worked for Buffalo Bill, he got paid. And on their paydays, they would get paid in $20 gold coins called double eagles, because they had 2 eagles on them. So Sitting Bull noticed something as they toured these major cities in the eastern United States: Philadelphia, New York, Boston, Baltimore, Washington. He noticed something that he had trouble wrapping his mind around, that just sort of blew his mind. Never seen before. And what he saw was some people living in opulence, living in absolute comfort and wealth, while other people starved. Even children. There were homeless, orphan, starving children in all these. Some people were living in mansions and had more than they could ever use. And he did not understand that, because that's not how his culture worked. In his culture, everybody shared. So if you're doing well, that means everybody's doing well. If you're doing bad, he was not successfully Americanized, or I suppose successfully turned into a good capitalist, because what he would do on his paydays is he would take his sack of coins and go down to a good capitalist, because what he would do on his paydays is he would take his sack of coins and go down to usually, if it was in the East Coast, down to the docks where the poorest people tended to be, where the homeless people were, especially the children. And he would just take his sack of gold coins and just toss them out to the children for them to have, because he didn't need them. He had food. So that is such an apt demonstration of the difference between Plains culture and indigenous culture, American culture in the sense of not Native American. All right, some other things that I wanted to talk about that are nigh universal and were universal on the Plains. Things like vision quests. This is where you go, usually to some isolated place, and you try to have a vision. Maybe you want an answer to a particular question, so you go on a vision quest. Maybe it's just a rite of passage and you're about to reach the point of adulthood, so it's expected. You go on a vision. It's expected. You go on a vision quest where you get a vision, basically laying out what your purpose in life is. Usually what this would involve would either be going to a high place, so you're closer to the heavens, or by running water, which is also sacred. And sort of chanting, singing, dancing around and around by yourself for hours and hours, and maybe for days without sleeping, until your mind had reached a point that it was open to the spirit world to show you visions. Now, on the one hand, you might say, well, if you didn't eat anything and you didn't sleep and you were just like dancing around for a couple of days, anybody's going to have a vision, and you have something there. But this is really not that different from traditions of other parts of the world, whether you're talking about Muslim holy men or Christians, monks and clerics, especially in the Middle Ages, who would do similar things so as to make their mind more to the spirit world. So vision quests. Also, the sweat lodge. This is actually something you found in almost every tribe in North America. And this is where, it's a purification ceremony. You have a circular lodge, some saplings, and plant them in, bury them in the ground, fold them over, make a circle, cover it with hides for a covering. And then inside there's a fire, there's a pit. Outside there's a big fire. And you put stones, great big stones, in that fire and burn them. Inside there's a fire, there's a pit. Outside there's a big fire. And you put stones, great big stones, in that fire and burn them, heat them until they're red hot. And then remove them from there, not by hand, and take them into that lodge, put them in that ceremony that's held. As people are sitting around, the person conducting the ceremony has a bucket of water and a dipper, a gourd dipper usually, and they dip water onto those red hot stones, and you're inside this thing with that door shut, and basically you have a sauna. And you are going to be purified, removing the impurities from your body and removing the impurities from your spirit. This also can help make you more susceptible to spiritual experience and to having visions. Although usually this was, it was done for the sake. But if there's another ritual you were going to do, an important ritual, you would always do this one first, so you're purified. Okay, another thing I want to talk about, particularly in reference to the Plains, is Gender identity. Perhaps you've heard of the concept two-spirit. People, which is something that is spoken of a lot in this 21st century as part of the tradition of native peoples recognizing more than two genders, recognizing more than two ways of being. Now, in reality, some tribes recognized that, and some tribes did not. But on the Great Plains, I have a list over there of tribes who did, and that's essentially all the tribes on the Great Plains. This may have been more common on the Great Plains than other parts of other regions of the country, even. So, a lot of times, this would be the result of either personal preference. Sometimes it was the result of a vision that your vision told you that you're meant. You've got boy parts, but you're meant to live as a woman, or vice versa. The French, when they were interacting with the Northern Plains tribes, looked at this and were aghast, right? Because they were from that European Christian tradition that says that anything other than what we would call heteronormative existence or activity is a horrible sin. So they referred to this type of people that they met among the native groups as a French insult, really, that before being applied to native people basically was what in French you would call the person on the the submissive or receiving end in a male homosexual act. So it's an insult. But the words that the native people had and the concepts were not insults. There was no insult here. There was nothing unnatural here. It was generally just accepted that if that's who you are, that's who you are. In fact, in almost every Plains tribe, someone who had one of these individuals, if you had one of these individuals in your family, you were considered to be very lucky, because they weren't only regarded as special, they were regarded as having special powers, maybe special spiritual, magical powers, or maybe special abilities, particularly abilities of diplomacy and helping people get along. The Lakota word for Dakota word winkta, both closely related languages, but each of these tribes had this concept. Now, so far as men who identified as and lived as women, and it's perfectly fine. No one thought anything bad about it at all. Now, women living as men, there were women who would become warriors in all of these groups, all of these tribes, or perhaps dress as men. But so far as women, not as common as the reverse, but among the Cheyennes, that was something that also was a thing. Now, if this is so common in the Plains tribes, and the Plains tribes are the ones that most often get represented in popular culture, why did many of you probably not know this? On Gunsmoke or Bonanza, you don't see it on old John Wayne westerns. In fact, probably the only major example in a Hollywood movie that I've seen that represents this and represents it accurately is the 1970 movie Little Big Man. Starring Dustin Hoffman as a white person who was adopted by Cheyennes when he was like 10 years old and raised as a Cheyenne warrior. And one of the supporting characters, one of the main characters in the movie, his good friend, Little Horse, in his as he was nearing adolescence, it was clear he identified as a woman, and so he lives as a woman, she. It is just perfectly normally accepted by everybody. I don't know if before 1970 you could have even shown this in a movie. And you still don't see that very often in Westerns, at least not the ones that are made by major Hollywood studios, but that's how it was.